We are about to launch into the second of our relatively new format meetings. So, for those of you that have been here a long time, you will know the entire progression from start to finish. We've identified lots of topics that we're interested in. We've taken some quite deep dives into what it is to prepare ourselves or to work with our communities, and so over time we've settled on this format. So you'll remember last time we were joined by Ben, who is here on the screen. Hi, Ben. Ben spoke to us about working with your community and made some really solid suggestions about actions that you could undertake or things you might contemplate, and including some very specific information around water treatment and water management. Today we are joined by Eric Garza, who many of you will know, I am sure. Eric has been in and out of this group. He's attended a couple of events over the time, and Eric has graciously volunteered himself to come along and talk about food energy, essentially, and how we and about foraging and wild foods, and how to manage that balance. So Eric is going to present for us for as long as he feels contented to speak. I think he has a few slides prepared. We'll then have a Q&A session where you will have the chance to ask questions of Eric, and then we will go into small breakout rooms as we did last time, and you will have an opportunity to talk with one another about how you've been impacted by what you have heard and what you might do with that information, how it will inform you and your own preparedness and the preparedness of the communities in which you find yourselves. But before any of that, to give us all an opportunity to breathe in and out and settle, we're going to have a round of check-ins. And because we are a full screen, I'd suggest we do that in 6 breakout rooms, perhaps. I think that's going to give us 4 people. So we can have either David or Susan, thank you, are going to set those rooms up. So as we often do, take a moment just to breathe together. Who are you? How would you like to be referred to? Your preferred name? Where in the world are you joining from? And how are you as you arrive in this space? Perhaps you've got some expectations or anticipation of what will unfold in the time that we share together. So we'll have about 10 minutes in breakout rooms, I think. That'll give you all about 2.5 minutes to check in. Any moment now, that invitation will pop up on your screen. Welcome back, everybody. I think we're all back now. I hope that was pleasant. Nice to connect with the people that you are in your space with. We're building relationships here at the same time as building our knowledge and resilience. In fact, those relationships are probably critical to our resilience. So feels like an important 10 minutes of each meeting to have that time to just check in with one another. Eric, I think it's over to you.
All right, over to me. So I was invited, and thank you for the gracious invitation, but I was invited to give a talk about food and foraging, and kind of the idea that I gravitated to is inviting us to think critically about food amidst today's converging crises. So that's what I'm going to take a crack at here. And my plan is to talk for about 20 minutes. And then maybe it'll be a little bit less than that. And then I will turn it back to the hosts, and we'll do some Q&A and go from there. Let's see if it is going to let me advance. There we go. So there's a couple ideas that I want to introduce. I apologize if these are ideas that some of you have already encountered in other venues. If you follow Nate Hagen's and Great Simplification podcast, you might have heard of them. Nate and I went to grad school together, so we have very much the same way of thinking about things. One of the ideas is endosomatic energy, and that is energy that is used within our bodies to drive metabolic activity, and we get this energy by eating food. The other idea is exosomatic energy, and this is energy that is used outside of the body to do things, to augment and to expand human capacities. And exosomatic energy might be, burning wood to create heat. It might be burning oil or gasoline to run a car. It might be using solar photovoltaics to generate electricity to power a light or to power a refrigerator or something like that. So exosomatic energy is energy that is used outside of the human body. Endosomatic energy is energy that is used inside the human body. And where I want to go next with this talk is to illustrate that so much of our lives, for those of us who live in relatively affluent societies and use all the modern contrivances that we typically do, is how much our lives are driven by this exosomatic energy use, and how that really warps our perception of the food sector, what kind of foods we utilize, what kind of processing methods we utilize. The way I want to do this is I would like to show a short YouTube video. Some of you might have seen this video already. If you haven't seen it, I would love to hear what you think of it. It's called Toaster Challenge, and it's a video where they got an Olympic cyclist whose nickname is Quadzilla, and you'll see why he has that nickname once I bring this up. But they put Quadzilla on a bike that is connected to a generator, and then they convert his motion into electricity to power a toaster. And so the operating question then is, can this Olympic cyclist with thighs like tree trunks generate enough power to actually toast a piece of bread? Or maybe saying that another way is, can he generate enough power for long enough to toast a piece of bread? And that's kind of like the setup for this YouTube video, because they don't go into all the particulars of that in the video itself. So we will watch this short video. So that is the short video. And of course, in this particular case, they made the toast. They toasted the bread using endosomatic energy with that particular setup. Well, most of the time we don't do that. We don't get on an exercise bike and pedal like nuts for a minute or 90 seconds to toast bread. We don't do that when we want to put something in the microwave. I don't even think most people would be able to generate enough power to operate an electric range. And so I just want us to be mindful, and this is, we can think of this throughout the food sector writ large, all the different food supply chains writ large, all the different ways that they use endosomatic energy, or exosomatic energy rather, from tractors on the farm to transportation to, machinery that processes food. And then of course, within our households, where we use various appliances in the process of preparing and cooking food, storing food. But just want to bring attention to all the different ways that we use exosomatic energy, and what types of exosomatic energy, where the ultimate primary sources of that energy are going to vary from place to place, and what kinds of appliances or machines you're using. But regardless, a lot of exosomatic energy. A couple, and this is US centric, but there are a couple studies that looked at how much energy it takes to produce a calorie of food. And at least here in the United States, and it's probably true for Canada as well, but at least here in the United States, Canada, it typically takes 10 to 12 calories of energy, most of that exosomatic industrial energy, to deliver 1 calorie of food. So we put in 10 calories of exosomatic energy and we get back 1 calorie of food. And that's, it's a lot of energy inputs, and it demonstrates that the food sector is just extraordinarily dependent on that exosomatic energy. I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about endosomatic energy. We think of all the different types of foods that we eat, and I guess I forgot to put dairy in here because I'm not a huge consumer of dairy, but I included a wide range of different types of vegetables, some plant-derived foods, grains, nuts, and meat, and just recognizing the calorie densities of some of these different groups of foods. And I want to invite people to think about this, because if our goal is to come up with a system where we are able to feed ourselves without so much relying on industrial food supply chains, then that is going to necessitate that we think a little bit more critically about where we are investing our energy, whether it's endosomatic energy or exosomatic energy, in producing local and regional food, and what we get back from that food production effort. What we get back in terms of calories, and of course what we get back in terms of minerals and vitamins and other nutrients too. So I wanted to break out a few groups of different foods and talk about them individually. And then I'll talk in a moment with the next slide, I'll talk about the calorie densities of some of these foods, and maybe that will invite us to think about how we might divvy our time up in terms of like what kinds of foods we would produce if our goal is self-production of food, or encouraging others around us to do that. So one of the groups are root crops. At least here in North America, probably the two most common root crops that we rely on heavily are things like potatoes, sweet potatoes, and of course there are others. I guess we could think of onions as a root crop, but their calorie densities are comparable more maybe to other types of vegetables, so I didn't put a photograph of those here. Fruits, when I think of fruit, I think of really any kind of plant part that is produced with the goal of reproduction. So you have usually seeds in it or on top of it. So things like blueberries and tomatoes and apples are fruit. Squash are fruit. Cucumbers are fruit. Melons. Cucumbers and melons are actually very closely related. But there's just a huge wide array of fruit. Some of them are more heavy with respect to sugars. Some of them more heavy with respect to fat. So those calories can come from different macronutrients. But fruits are one type of food. And then vegetables more generally are any part of a plant that is not a fruit and is not a rootstock. So talking about leaves and stems and flowering parts before the fruit is formed. When we eat broccoli, the broccoli floret is basically the flowers that haven't opened yet. Cabbage are leaves, and of course, celery is stems. A lot of different types of vegetables. Meats are pretty self-explanatory, the muscles of various animals. Nuts, I've got pictured walnuts, hazelnuts, and acorns. I'm interested in foraging, and one of the things that I've really been working on in the last handful of years is finding more calorie-dense things that I can forage. People in my part of the country make a big deal about ramps, which are wild onions, and fiddleheads, which are the unopened swirls of ferns, as things that you might gather that are edible. And they are edible, and they do taste good, but the calorie density is very low, and there's really not a whole lot of nutrition in those. So I'm interested in gathering things that have a lot more calorie density and a lot more nutrition, so I'm getting a lot more of a payback for the energy that I invest to gathering things. And acorns are one of the things that can provide that. And maybe I'll talk a little bit more about acorns later on if people are interested in that. And another group of foods that people rely on a lot are seeds. I guess nuts are seeds, but I think of nuts as being a lot more fat. A lot more of those calories come from fat. And nuts are typically from trees. Actually, I think exclusively from trees. Whereas other seeds that we eat are grains, cereal grains, and then legumes. We think of peanuts as a nut, but a peanut is actually a legume. It's not really a nut. So beans are legumes, and then of course I've got a photograph here of wheat berries and white rice. So all of these provide, and other foods too that would not fit in this group, because again, I forgot to add dairy products here. But all of these provide the energy that our bodies would use to create endosomatic energy. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the calorie densities, the relative calorie densities of some of these, because I think this can inform us if we embark on a gardening adventure or if we want to go out and start foraging for things. It can inform us in terms of how we might invest our time and energy in order to get the most calories back, the most edible calories back from that self-production or foraging adventure. So when we think about root crops like potatoes and sweet potatoes, the calorie densities of these vary somewhat, and maybe you'll find some that are outside of the range that I've offered. But these typically yield calorie densities of 70 to 90 calories per 100 grams. And in the grand scheme of things, that is kind of low to moderate, and partly why the calorie densities of these foods are so relatively low is because, like a lot of fruits and vegetables, roots are oftentimes mostly water. So a potato, even though it feels pretty solid, is usually 80% water. Sweet potato is a little bit more fibrous, so the water content is a little bit lower, but it's still mostly water. So when you put forth the effort to gather that or put forth the effort to grow that, when you actually pick the final thing, most of what you're picking is water. So the calorie density is low to moderate, but it's higher than some other things. Fruit have typically lower calorie densities, generally lower calorie densities than roots do, but at least with respect to sweet fruits, where the sugar content is fairly high, that higher sugar content can mean that the calorie densities are on the higher end. So I wrote down a calorie density range of 20 to 60 calories per 100 grams. Really sweet fruits like blueberries, strawberries, things like that are going to be closer to that high end, whereas fruits like a cucumber, for example, that doesn't have a very high sugar content, are going to be towards the lower end. And a lot of fruits also have a very high water content. Vegetables, stems, leaves, unopened buds, are typically lower calorie density still. So a lot of the foods that we eat, vegetables that we eat that are leaves, so things like cabbage, lettuce, are going to have very low calorie densities. There's not a lot there that we can actually digest. So 15 calories per 100 grams is normal. And then you get to more solid vegetables like broccoli, onions, things like that, and you're going to end up with the higher calorie densities, 40 calories plus or minus. When we start getting to higher calorie densities, I'll go to the meat section first here. One of the reasons why hunter-gatherers viewed meat as a sought-after food, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that hunter-gatherers viewed meat as kind of a sought-after food, is because the calorie density of meat is higher than a lot of what you would get from fruits, vegetables, and even roots. Part of this comes from the fact that meats oftentimes have fat in them, usually not a ton, but some. And fat has more energy, bioavailable energy in it as a macronutrient than carbohydrates and sugars do. So you have something that has a fairly high fat content, it's going to tend to have a higher calorie density. The other thing is that, generally speaking, meat, the flesh of animals has a lower water content than a lot of plants do. A typical type of meat is going to have 65-70% water, whereas a lot of these other fruits and vegetables are going to be 75-80 up to 95% water. So you're eating less water and you're eating more other stuff that has calorie value. The next step up, and I'm going to go all the way to the lower left on my screen, are legumes. And these calorie densities are for the dry legumes, dry grains. If you were to cook these, obviously they're going to absorb a lot of water during the cooking process. And so the calorie densities might fall by half or more, depending on how much water they absorb. But when we're looking at the dry goods, we're looking at calorie densities around, 250 to 350 kilocalories per 100 grams. A lot of that comes from carbohydrates, various types of starches, but it's still a pretty high calorie density. And like I said, usually you cook them in water. They're going to absorb a lot of water. The calorie densities might fall to 100 kilocalories per 100 grams or, maybe up to 200. But it's still pretty calorie dense, more calorie dense than most fruits and vegetables are. So that's worth thinking about. Growing grains can be, and beans can be a lot of work, but it can offer a pretty solid payback. And, I suppose you could go out there and you could forage grass seed, which, when we think of wheat and corn and rice, these are all grasses. So whenever we eat rice, we're eating grass seed. Whenever you make bread out of wheat, you're making bread out of grass seed. Whenever you eat corn, you're eating grass seed. So you could go out and you could forage grass seed too, but gathering it is a lot of work. And then the last one are nuts. And again, these are the calorie densities for dried nuts. But a lot of these nuts we do eat when they're dried. Some of them might require some processing. But because a lot of nuts have a pretty high fat content, this is where you see really, really big calorie densities. So I don't remember right off the cuff where each of these individual nuts fall in this range. Depending on what type of acorn you gather, 500 kilocalories per 100 grams is common. I think it's walnuts is up in the 600s, hazelnuts is in the middle between them. So these nuts can have pretty high fat contents and they're going to yield a lot of calories. So if you have a way of gathering some kind of a nut-based crop or growing a nut-based crop, putting effort into that is a great way to get a lot of calories, a lot of edible calories back. The next slide is really just me offering a bunch of questions that I would invite us to think about, and we can play with some of these in the Q&A. Maybe you'll play with some of these in the small groups that you migrate into after the Q&A. Some of the questions that I would invite us to think about as we think about food and ensuring our access to food if some kind of crazy stuff happens and the trucks stop running. But when you think about a particular type of food, number one, how many inputs does it take to grow? Do you need fertilizer? How much labor does it take? Do you need pesticides? How much land? How many inputs does it take to grow a particular food item? The next question is, how much effort does it actually take to harvest this? When you pluck something off of a plant, is that a significant amount of food? Plucking one blueberry is a small amount of food. Plucking a big apple or a big dry squash like a butternut squash is a lot more food. If you have to go and pluck individual grains off of a wheat plant, that's a lot of effort to harvest that, unless you're going to use some kind of a machine like a combine. What kind of infrastructure does this food require to store? Do I need to have a freezer in order to store this over the long term? Can I use a root cellar? Or do I not even need a root cellar? Can I just, and this is true with acorns, as long as you keep them dry, you can just store them in a bucket. They don't require refrigeration. and you can store them for years. What kind of infrastructure does it require for me to store this type of food that I am growing or gathering? And then we rarely eat foods in the same form that we might store them in. So what kind of processing does it require in order for me to prepare something into a form that I would actually eat it? And of course, this includes shelling nuts. This includes grinding grain. This also includes all the accoutrements that go along with, baking something or cooking it, or chopping it up if it's something that is, a pretty hard thing like butternut squash. So what kind of processing does it require for me to prepare this into a form that I can actually eat it and derive some kind of nourishment? And then lastly, and this ties directly into the calorie densities that I was talking about a moment ago, how much of this do I have to eat in order to feel satisfied? Or maybe putting that another way, how much of this do I have to eat in order to derive a meaningful amount of nourishment from it? If you've got something that has a very low calorie density, then you're going to have to eat a huge amount of that in order to get any significant amount of nourishment. If you gravitate towards things that have higher calorie densities, you're not going to have to eat as much. That's another reason why I'm interested in acorns in particular, is because with that high calorie density, I can make a pancake-like thing out of acorn flour, and they're going to be almost twice as calorie dense as a pancake made out of wheat. So I can eat one of those pancakes, and it's like its own meal. You don't have to eat a lot of food, and you get a lot of satisfaction. I teach a course at the University of Vermont called The Real Cost of Food, and it's one facet of it is food numeracy. So students are doing problem sets, and I list a bunch of different foods and have students look up their calorie density and say, okay, if you wanted to get 2,000 calories from each of these foods, how many pounds of this would you have to eat every day in order to get those 2,000 calories? And I don't remember all of the answers off the top of my head, but I remember one of the things I ask my students about is broccoli. Reflecting on broccoli's calorie density, which is pretty low, you would have to eat like 16 pounds of broccoli every day to get 2,000 calories. No one is going to do that. I don't care how much you like broccoli, no one is going to do that. So you're going to need something in your diet that has a much higher calorie density in order to make things work. So these are the questions that I came up with. This is pretty much the talk that I wanted to give. Kat and David, do you want me to stop sharing the screen as we transition into the Q&A, or do you want me to leave this up?
It would be great to stop the screen share, because then we can all see one another, Eric.
Very good.
Thank you so much for that. For the presentation and for the research that went into that. I very, very, very much appreciate it. Some really interesting questions that you raised. It's time now for you have the opportunity to ask Eric some questions. So Eric has hinted at knowledge beyond this presentation that he has. So don't feel like you have to keep your questions to just the things that you have seen and heard. But yeah, now you have the opportunity for the next, well, however long we need really, to raise any questions with Eric. David, go ahead.
I have only a little bit of knowledge, but I understand that acorns require substantial processing after they're harvested. There's a leaching process or something. Maybe you could talk about what it takes to make acorns palatable, please.
Yeah. Acorns, like all seeds, so legumes are seeds, cereal grains are seeds, nuts are all seeds. Like all seeds, acorns contain various forms of phytic acid, and they contain lectins. One type of lectin that acorns have a lot of are tannins. And so you do need to reduce the quantity of those phytic acids, and you need to reduce the quantity of those lectins. So there is a leaching process. I wouldn't say that it's a lot of work. What makes it significant is the fact that there are stages that require a lot of waiting. So the way that I've typically done it is to grind up the dry acorns into a meal and then soak that in repeated changes of alkaline water, and tannins will dissolve preferentially in alkaline water. And so after a handful of changes of that water, you can drain off enough of the tannins to make the acorns palatable. And, for those of you who are familiar with tamales and tortillas, the nixtamalization process that indigenous people use to make masa, which is used to make tortillas and used to make tamales, is a similar process. It's there to remove, among other reasons, it's there to remove the lectins. So I'm actually going to be experimenting this fall on putting acorns through the nixtamalization process to see if I get a similar product. Because the nixtamalization process is over maybe 24 hours, whereas when I do the soaking method that I've been using, it's over 5 or 6 days.
Thank you. Cynthia, your hand is up, and then we'll come to Fernando and then David.
Thanks. So I'm wondering, do you have like the number of calories required to support an adult human, a male human and a female human? And do you have the amount of calories required for, say, an adolescent human? I'm just kind of wondering, what are we aiming for here in terms of viability for living, in terms of how many calories do each of these beings need in order to survive?
Yeah, that is a great question. I will say that the answer to that question is going to vary as a function of a lot of things. So how physically large are you? Not all men are the same size. Not all women are the same size. Not all, adolescents are the same size. A good rule of thumb, and I use this in a lot of my classes when I have students do calculations, is that you can use the average value of about 2,000 calories per day. That's an average, kind of a rule of thumb sort of a thing. The average woman probably only needs maybe 1,700, 1,800 calories a day. And when you get down to an adolescent, they might only need like 12 or 1,500. But again, it's going to vary a lot depending on body size, depending on metabolic rate, and also to a degree depending on what kind of foods you're eating. Because the calorie values you see when you look up the nutritional content of a food, unfortunately, are not always representative of how many calories, how much bioavailable energy a person can get from that. And that comes from just the limitations in the ways we have of measuring the calorie content of things. We're beyond the days where you just put food in a bomb calorimeter, light it on fire, and see how much excess energy is released. But we're still not to a point where we can do an assay of a particular food and get a sense for how much bioavailability not only our digestive systems could get from it, but also all the bacteria that live in our guts that can digest parts and then release useful energy to us as short-chain fatty acids. So yeah, I don't have a precise answer for you, but that is a rough estimate.
Thanks. Thank you both. And Eric, Vlad's written into the chat box 3,100 calories if you take into consideration the need for physical manual labor, such as living off the land and growing your food and harvesting and the labor required for that rather than maintenance values. But I guess, as Eric says, there's no precise answer. There's several questions in the chat box. We will come to those. But for now, can I come to you, Fernando?
Yes, Kat. Thanks, Eric, for your talk. It was very informative. The 10 to 12 calorie statistic was very sobering. I think your questions allude to this, the input, the infrastructure, the effort. But is there any information, or maybe if you want to just discuss it, the general energy return or net energy that maybe some of these foods would require, if assuming you would do it in a much more endosomatic type of way? Like maybe you can just kind of discuss the concept generally, or any sources you have.
Yeah. Um, in an earlier version of the talk that I gave, I cut this slide out because I was worried it would take up too much time. But one of the things that I presented in there was data on gathering wild meat, but also data on gathering acorns. So, I went fishing a couple of falls ago and collected really intricate data on all the stuff that I was doing involved in that fishing trip, including, me actually walking down to the place, doing the fishing, catching the fish, bringing the fish back, cleaning them. And then I weighed out the fillets I got at the end. And I was able to calculate that my energy return on energy investment, and this is just endosomatic energy. I didn't figure out the embodied energy of my fishing rod or the knife I used to fillet the fish or anything. But the energy return on invested for that trip was like 9-to-1, which means I put in 1 calorie of endosomatic energy as labor and got back about 9.5 calories of bioavailable energy embedded in the fish fillets. So a pretty good return, a pretty profitable return. I also collected a bunch of data a couple of years ago on acorn processing. And, the process of turning acorns into flour, edible flour, is intricate. But like I said earlier, it involves a lot of waiting. There's not a lot of physical work. So I calculated with a very small sample size of acorns that I would get about a 5.5 return. So I put in 1 calorie in the process of gathering and processing acorns, and I would get 5.5 calories of energy back. I am very confident that if I gathered in larger quantities, I could increase that energy return dramatically, maybe up by a factor of 3. So I'm thinking I can get an energy return of 10-to-1 or maybe even 15-to-1 for acorns if I do it in more and benefit from economies of scale. That particular project, I, for whatever reason, decided I was going to do 100 acorns, 100 individual acorns, which is just a little handful. But if I were to gather like a gallon at a time or a couple of kilograms at a time and put that whole thing through the process, there's just so many efficiencies of scale that I would get from doing that. It would make a huge difference. So those are a couple examples. And the fact that you see good returns from those kinds of things isn't surprising because, a lot of people, indigenous communities, make their living on fishing. And especially in the U.S. West Coast, acorns made up as much as 50% of the calories that some of the indigenous people ate every year. So, yeah, not surprising that yields a good return. They gravitated towards things that yielded good returns. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you, Eric.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Fernando, for that question. David, we'll come to you, and then I think we need a few moments to wade through the chat because there's quite a lot of discussion going on there. David, lovely to see you. Welcome from New Zealand. Hi, Taroa.
Hi, thanks for that. I think this is one of my criticism of Nate Hagen's as he focuses on energy, which is scientifically valid, of course. But one of the things I thought about was someone can have very high output in terms of calories and be ill. So a healthy person doesn't necessarily have to have a lot of calories, and vice versa. You can have lower calories but be healthier. To make this point more succinct, most people are eating, say, 3 or 4 meals a day plus grazing through the day. So they're poisoning themselves in terms of the metabolism. But, you can have a very fit, energetic person that's very ill. I mean, that muscle guy that we saw, I'm not saying he's got cancer or anything, but he could be living a very toxic lifestyle and be ill. And the flip side of that, I suppose, are people eating just for calories, or are they eating to be happy? I think if we want to survive, we want to have food that relates to our diet, making us happy or joyful or something, rather than what calorie levels I've got. And the flip side of that is, if we're eating protein, carbohydrates, and fat, what are the proportions to make us healthily happy? I think happy and healthy is sort of like a... So are we surviving because we want to be working machines that can function, or are we eating as part of a quality of life that's not necessarily to do with our longevity, but the fact that we're happy, functioning, healthy people? So yeah, but that's me with Nate Hagens. I'm not a big fan of his analysis of where we're at. That's my prejudice, if you like.
Thanks, David. Eric, did you want to make any comment?
I mean, I guess what I'll say, I didn't discern like a specific question in that comment. I interpreted it as more of a comment, but the comment is a good one. People eat food for a lot of different reasons. Some people eat food for dopamine and to regulate their mood. Some people eat food for the nutrition and the calories. Some people eat food for cultural reasons, to feel like they belong in a group of people that eats a similar food. So people can eat foods for a lot of different reasons. And I think it is worth thinking about, like, why do we eat, and why do we choose the foods that we choose, and having some critical self-reflection in that world, in that field, is not a bad thing. And I also think that orthorexia is a real thing and can be pretty debilitating, and so we need to find a space where we invest a little bit of critical self-reflection, and we don't let ourselves get crazy stressed out about what we are or are not eating, and because the stress can have an impact too. So yeah, I guess that's what I have to say at that point.
Thank you, Eric. And of course, as identified by several comments in the chat, all of this assumes a degree of choice when push comes to shove. And we don't know how any of this will unfold ultimately, and it depends very much on where we live and the climate conditions and how much nature and wildlife we have adjacent to where we are or within easy reach. There are a million unanswered questions and conditions that all impact this. Gail, you have your hand up. Can I invite you to bring the question?
Well, it's almost like what you were saying. How do we know what to grow? I can look at all of the food energy and what makes us healthy, but we've got, whether it's permaculture or whether it's our own garden, or how I'm in Kalamazoo and went to the farmer's market today. So they're growing lots of food around here. But if we have a crisis, how do people do this? How do they grow food? And I grew up in a farm. I know how to can food. I learned how to hydrate food for eggs and stuff. But it's we're talking about, how do you get it? How do you know? Oh, that's kind of my question.
Okay.
Thanks, Gail.
Yeah, I guess I could go down a lot of different threads from that, but one of the threads that I will go down is, I think it's very valuable to rely on foods that are available that you don't necessarily have to grow, that require very little input from people. And there's also something to be said, when the feces hits the fan, so to speak, and everybody's scrounging for whatever it is they can get. There's also something to be said for learning how to use food that most other people don't perceive as food. And this is another reason why I'm interested in acorns, because at least in the part of the United States where I live, most people don't recognize them as food. So if the feces hits the fan and I'm out gathering acorns, I'm not going to have much competition for that. Whereas like people who have big gardens and are growing squash and things that other people recognize as food, they're going to have to figure out a way to keep the masses away from their stash. But yeah, I didn't add the question about, competition and how do you find food that other people aren't going to take to that list. But that is definitely something that could be added to that list.
Thanks, Eric. And I think that's a key, isn't it, in terms of foraging? It's not a proposition that you could sustain yourself solely from foraging, but it's a diversification of your skills, and it's about broadening your capacities and your potential, and the potential of your individual communities. Cynthia, you're next, and then Ben.
Yeah, a lot of people are sort of positing different scenarios in the chat, and I'm wondering, Eric, what scenario do you give your students, for instance? There's so many. There's we can gradually move into this need to be more sustainable in our communities, or we can have a cataclysmic event. What are you using? I'm kind of using if I'm in a community, what do I bring to the table to help the community to grow food? What knowledge? But so, Eric, what scenario are you considering here?
Well, just to address part of your question, I don't necessarily give these scenarios to my students and have them try to work through things. That's not like a core element of the classes that I teach. That'd be an interesting piece to add, but it's not something that's there currently. And then, to address your questions more head on in terms of what scenarios am I planning for, I guess I would say all of the above. Like here in Vermont, not last year, we got a reprieve last year, but 2023, 2024, we had absolutely catastrophic flooding that washed out a number of roads, including some pretty important roads that isolated groups of people because they couldn't get out, because of washed out roads, that prevented trucks from delivering supplies. So you have that kind of cataclysmic event that cuts people off. And so for people here in my state, the possibility of that is real. We feel that now. It's not just something that might happen in the future. It's part of people's lived experiences. And then, there are people also that are just, they don't have a lot of access to money. Maybe they don't have the skills to get a high-paying job. Maybe they have some kind of disability that prevents them from working. And so there's a necessity on their part to find ways of accessing food that's outside of the commercial sphere. Maybe that's growing it. Maybe that's foraging. Maybe that's building relationships with neighbors who can do that. So there's that piece of it. And then, I think that investing in your own skills, whether that is for growing foods, for gathering foods, for hunting, for fishing, for the most part, I don't think making those kind of investments is ever a bad investment. Those will almost always yield paybacks. And then, how do you integrate, what I, as an individual, do with other people I'm around? My neighbors, other, friends, come together and come up with maybe not a plan, but just acknowledging okay, these are the roles that I can play, and if the feces hits the fan, I'll do my best to make sure that folks stay fed.
Thanks both. Another valuable comment from Emily in the chat box around food and food stockpiling for other eventualities. So quite right, the evidence and information that Eric is providing, the conversations around foraging, the food strategy is no single thing. It's all of those things, and not alone. It's all of those things in community. It's all of those things in relationship. So yeah, it's a really big, broad topic. Ben.
Hi. Yeah, just a maybe a couple random thoughts that touches on a couple comments ago. The way I like to look at like what to grow and kind of the evolution of what I'm doing from a foraging and food resiliency standpoint for my like household and neighborhood is really focusing on kind of two things. One is the fact that, really most weeds are cultivated plants that were brought over from Europe. And, we don't typically eat them, but they all have generally medicinal or food value to them. Plantain, purslane, dandelions, a lot of leafy greens are out there that can provide kind of the nutritional side as a counterpoint to the caloric side. And tons of, just pull them out of the sidewalk. The other thing is, and the kind of the native history, your food history, a lot of which has been destroyed through colonialization, but a lot of people have been working to reestablish and understand it. And so, like in the Mid-Atlantic and the Eastern U.S., we have the Eastern Agricultural Complex, and so there's a lot of native plants, typically, of course, the seeds and nut trees, but also root crops like Apios americana, the wapato, which is a wetland plant, or sunchokes. And so all of these, kind of to Eric's point, are they're native, but they're also not going to be very visible to most people. They're not going to be able to see that and say like, oh, that's food. It's and so I do guerrilla gardening to kind of spread some of this stuff around, similar to the native ancestors that lived on this land prior to white settlement. And and that is a investment in someone's future.
Yep. And thinking about the calorie density root crops, so things like cattail root masses are largely starch. So you can certainly treat those as a vegetable. And that's another thing, people walk past large wetlands filled with cattail and they don't see that as food. But you do have to get muddy to harvest it.
That's certainly true. You do. But maybe when you're hungry, you'll be less bothered about mud, huh?
It's good for your microbiome.
This is such a lively conversation, and it is always my intention for us to have some time in breakout rooms to do that kind of accountability part of this, about how is this going to inform our own preparedness and our own activity. But I think, Eric, if you have a moment to glance down the chat, you'll notice that there are several comments, and you might want to pick up one or two of those as well. So if you just take a moment to do that. Certainly this topic around food resilience, the stuff that Eric brought in today around the energy and just having that consciousness around the decisions and choices that we are making. And there is and remembering there is no single right answer for this. All of us live in different places. We live in different contexts. We live in different biomes. We live with different climatic challenges. So there is no one answer. All of what's been shared today is really incredibly valuable. And it's a matter of what you are able to do in the places where you live. It will never be enough. We know that.
Yeah.
There are 8 billion people on the planet. Almost certainly that number will reduce very drastically in the years and decades ahead. So it's a sobering conversation. I suppose the question for all of us is, who are we choosing to be now, and what are the things that we have within our power to do? What can we do? What can we take responsibility for? And that will be a different response for all of us, but a healthy reminder that there is no single answer. There is no right thing to do. There is only what's contextual.
Yep. One of the questions and this actually relates to a few different questions I've seen popping up. I think it was Jimmy asked, how many have the acres to sustain ourselves? And I guess what I want to respond to that is we can look at acreage that we use to sustain ourselves as like, okay, I have to control this piece of land and use it only for me. Or, I can almost ask, like, how can I protect a commons and then draw from that? So, like, the oaks that I harvest from are not on property that I own. They're part of common land in the city of Burlington. And theoretically, anyone could harvest from them, but nobody else seems to do that. Yeah. So the question of how many acres does it take to sustain a person is, I wonder if by asking that question, we're almost kind of like moving ourselves off on a tangent away from something that is maybe more useful, which is like, what kind of foods am I drawing from? Was someone saying something?
Yeah, it was Jimmy. You've muted yourself again, Jimmy. Open your mic and come back in.
My last bunch of side jobs were rewilding a bunch of houses out west of me, and our church here has got a big place where, well, relative to Chicago, where people can grow a little of their own food. I'm perfectly aware of those things and was when I asked that question. I'm an ally. The reason I asked that question and the reason it's so important to me is I grew up with a soil scientist mother who was worried about all these things way back when my old ass was in high school. The way we farm now is a desperate stopgap measure that was supposed to be stopped decades ago. Really. Seriously. Literally. Quite literally. It sounds like hyperbole, but this was the way we farm now was supposed to be stopped decades ago. It was a stopgap measure. And I could go on and on and on and on about things like that. So I was a pathfinder too in the military, and that's the kind of guy who's like, hi, we're going to drop you in the middle of nowhere. You're all by yourself. You probably don't have the internet. Goodbye. And I hate to be Mr. Negative, but I'm Mr. Autistic Factual guy. And I don't see these things being answered. I think things are going to be a lot worse than all that.
And perhaps, Jimmy, there are no answers. Sorry, David. Perhaps, Jimmy, there are no answers. And that's part of what we need to cultivate as well, is this idea that we don't have agency. So, yeah.
I thought that was a little too, that's kind of where I was going.
Let me, if I may, jump in real quick and pose it this way for Eric. We don't believe that we will stop collapse. We don't believe that we will save the world. I posit that. But the activities and knowledge that you are cultivating do have some important role in our response to what's going on around us. And I wonder if you could speak to the value of the knowledge and practices that you're doing with regard to the larger collapse phenomenon that we see.
Sure, I can try. I guess what I would say, I buy into all the things you posited, and also to what Kat posited, that the 8.1 or 8.2 billion people that we have today is a temporary phenomenon, and of course I'm not going to try to forecast population decline at some point, but I'm not sure how much longer we'll be able to maintain the kind of population growth that we have, even with modern agriculture, because the yields are starting to decline for some key crops for a variety of reasons. But yeah, I guess I gravitate towards the stuff that I do mainly for harm reduction. I recognize that depending on what region you're in, the day the trucks stop running could be a really terrifying day. I think of people who live out in like Phoenix, Arizona, for example, or other places that are dependent on fossil aquifers for water or water withdrawals from a big river that is suffering from drought. I read an article not long ago that there's some town or county in Texas that expects to completely run out of water by September of this year, maybe. I might not be remembering the details exactly. But there are places that are just are ill-suited for human habitation. If that human habitation requires farming and gardening the way that we typically conceive of it. I happen to live, and I'm very grateful and very lucky in this regard, to live in a place that can sustain some degree of gardening and farming. And so in that very specific context, like I said, I'm interested in harm reduction. How can I try and keep people fed? And even in the state of Vermont, it's an impossible task, in fairness. There's folks that have done research and came up with numbers that even if everyone in the state of Vermont, plowed up their lawns and grew food, probably at best we could feed 30% of the people that live here, which means that 70% of the people aren't going to get fed if the trucks stop running and we can't import food. Vermont is far down the path of overshoot. But I don't give up. It's not in my nature.
Thank you.
Right on, Eric.
What a lovely sentiment to finish on, Eric. It would be very easy for any of us in any given moment to give up. But we're still here. Every second Saturday, determined to do what little we can do, regardless of whether or not it bears fruit. And that's another incredibly powerful sentiment, isn't it? We're not doing this because there's a guarantee of success. We're not doing this because it leads to our survival. We're not doing this because it's going to stop the trajectory that we have been on for hundreds of years. This is not new. We're doing this because it's the right thing to do right now. And what else would we do with ourselves other than lead very hedonistic lifestyles and dancing and partying and singing? And I'm sure we'd get bored with that very quickly. Gardening and foraging and learning how to stop bleeding all feels very meaningful and very worthwhile. We would have had time in a breakout room to postulate, to just kind of pose that question to ourselves about how have we been impacted and influenced by what Eric has shared with us and by the conversation that has just happened. We're not going to have the time to do that with a little over 9 minutes of our time together left. I think it's very important for us to have our little checkout ritual. But what I would encourage each of you to do at the end of this meeting is to just take a few moments before you dash off to the very next thing that is demanding your attention. Please find a few moments just to sit and consider what you have heard. Just take a few moments to think about how does this or how might this inform you in your context. If it all feels like it's irrelevant and it doesn't, and it jars you, or it doesn't feel like it resonates, you don't have to take any of it. But if your mind is open, and if you have heard something that has inspired you, or perhaps opened a doorway of exploration or imagining that you hadn't had before, just take a few moments to contemplate that. Scribble down in a book how you're going to use this knowledge. Before I stop talking and pass on to all of you for your checkouts, we don't currently have a speaker for 2 weeks from today. And I'm going to keep banging on about how all of you, even those of you who are in this moment looking over your shoulder going, she can't be talking to me. I am. I'm talking to every single one of you. You all have a practice or an activity or are participating in something that would be interesting and informative for the rest of us. If you are happy to put your name forward and to be as brave as Eric has been today and as Ben was 2 weeks ago, please pop your email in the inbox, in the chat box for me, and I will be in touch in the next week. If no one comes forward, you will be stuck with me. And I will talk a little bit about negotiation and how and the challenges associated with conversations with people you may not get along with. But you have to admit that's fairly boring compared with the last two topics. So now is your chance to nominate yourself to to get involved. Eric, thank you so much for what you have gifted us with today. Eric has, for all of you, popped some information in the chat box for us, including his current website and an email, and also his PayPal. Eric has, I know, been almost definancializing himself over the last few years, but as all of us understand, it takes a little bit of money to survive. So if you are inspired, if you're in a position to help Eric with his own mission, or you want more information, do reach out. I know that Eric would be very responsive and happy to engage with any of you. And with that, we might just have enough time for a one-word checkout. Maybe 3 if you join them all together with no punctuation. Ben, can you start us off, followed by Katie?
I thought it was a great talk and a really good conversation.
Katie, and then Susan P.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear. What are we supposed to say?
Just to check out, a farewell message, Katie.
Farewell. See you next time.
Thanks. Susan, and then Matthew.
I just want to say thank you to Eric for doing such a good presentation and giving us this really good information. I'm going to be looking into it more. Thanks.
Terrific. Matthew, and then Carol, you've got your hand up, so maybe your checkout could be the question you were about to pose.
Lovely to see you, Eric, and thank you. I'm looking at an oak tree right now. I've got gumption, and whether my neighbours would be interested.
Carol, and then Vlad.
Thank you for the information. It's very valuable. I shall now look around Louisville for some oak trees, and it's something to nurture other people. Many blessings.
Thank you, Carol. Vlad, and then Victor.
I'm grateful to have met you all.
Thank you, Vlad. Victor, and then David B.
Thank you, Eric. It was a thought-provoking presentation, so I'll be looking around with new eyes.
Thanks, David, and then Fernando.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eric. I really like how the extreme practicality and knowledge you bring fits in with our larger context of harm reduction and personal equanimity.
Marvelous. Fernando, and then Gail, please.
Yeah, Eric, thanks so much for your information and expertise and the example that you're providing by not just teaching these things, but experiencing them and then sharing what you're finding, I think is very valuable. And thank to all of you for all your questions and conversation. And the oak trees in my neighborhood are becoming much more valuable these days. So thank you.
Gail, and then Emily Petrin.
I feel the same way. You've opened my mind to think of other things besides just gardening. Oak trees. Okay, thank you. Lots of
Emily, and thank you. Emily, and then Daniel.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation, and thank you to everyone for fostering such a nice space. It's my first time here on the Saturday, and I'll be returning. Thank you.
Daniel, and then Angela.
Thanks, Eric. That was great to see that again. Good presentation on the calories and understanding how that works in our lives. I know everybody's in a different space, so do what works in your area. And belief is not action, so hopefully work on what you need.
Brilliant. Angela, lovely to see you here. And then Laura.
Thank you for the food for thought.
Laura, and then Suzanne.
Yes, thank you, Eric. I know I'm thinking a lot more widely than I was before, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
Brilliant. Suzanne and Heineck.
Thank you so much, Eric. It's made me rethink my approach to foraging.
Heineck and Ben. Oh no, we had Ben already, didn't we? And then Eric. Heineck and then Eric.
Yeah, thank you very much for the list of the questions, because very often the subsistence ends with producing it, but the next list of storing and so gets forgotten. Thank you for that.
Eric and then Katie.
Yep. Just thanks for your attention.
Katie, if you'd like to speak, and then Sherry.
Didn't I already go?
Oh, sorry, the screen must have bounced around. Sherry and then Jimmy, please.
Thank you, Eric. It was a really helpful presentation. This was my first time here too. Really appreciated it. And just wanted to say I had excellent food made with acorn flour at the Acorn restaurant in British Columbia in Vancouver. And they used all different they use every part of every plant. Really terrific place. My daughter lives there, so I was there visiting. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sherry. Jimmy and then Jane in the dark.
Thank you so much, Eric. It's always nice to see all of you. I hope you guys can find some fun this weekend.
Thank you. Jane and then Den.
Yeah, the sun's gone down here in France. Thank you, Eric, and thank you everyone for your contributions.
Thank you. Den. Oh, Den is visiting with friends in Sydney and may not feel able to speak because he's trying not to wake them up. Hey, was that everyone? Cynthia, I missed you, did I?
Yes. Thank you, Eric. That's brilliant. And I just appreciate everybody being here and recognizing all of the differences, but yet the sum of the whole is greater than the parts, or whatever that saying is. Thank you.
Marvelous. Well done. Thank you so much, everyone. We're right on time. Really appreciate it. Cynthia, I'll be in touch with you this week about a topic for next time. Go well, everybody.